All right, everybody. Thank you for RSVPing, and thank you to our panels for coming up today. This is a panel about the Ukraine resolution that was suggested, I believe, 4 months back now, on what should the DSA and Socialists do or demand for Congress to do when it comes to the war in Ukraine. I'm Dominic. I'm going to be your chair. We have two sides here. One is for the resolution, one is against. In this first part, we're going to have two 25-minute segments, with the fourth side deciding to have gone first beforehand, and they'll get to decide how long they, in that time, each panel speaks for. And then the other side will go, and then we'll have a open question discussion at the end. I believe without further ado, then let's begin.
Sure. My name is Wilhelm. I'm a co-chair of Seattle DSA and a member of Marxist Unity Group. Speaking for the resolution, so I'll be speaking first. And I'd like to begin just by reading the official DSA statement on the war in Ukraine. I believe it's quite good and still relevant, and it's pretty short. The Democratic Socialists of America condemns Russia's invasion of Ukraine and demands immediate diplomacy and de-escalation to resolve this crisis. We stand in solidarity with the working classes of Ukraine and Russia, who will undoubtedly bear the brunt of this war, and with anti-war protesters in both countries and around the world who are calling for a diplomatic resolution. This extreme and asymmetrical escalation is an illegal act under the United Nations Charter and severely threatens the livelihoods and well-being of working class peoples in Ukraine, Russia, and across the region. We urge an immediate ceasefire and the total withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. There is no solution through war or further intervention. This crisis requires an immediate international anti-war response, demanding de-escalation, international cooperation, and opposition to unilateral coercive measures, militarization, and other forms of economic and military brinksmanship that will only exacerbate the human toll of this conflict. DSA reaffirms our call for the US to withdraw from NATO and to end the imperialist expansionism that set the stage for this conflict. We call on anti-war activists in the US and across the world to oppose violent escalations, demand a lasting diplomatic solution, and stress the crucial need to accept any and all refugees resulting from this crisis. Much of the next 10 years are coming into view through this attack. While the failures of neoliberal order are clear to everyone, the ruling class is trying to build a new world through a dystopic transition grounded in militarism, imperialism, and war. Socialists have a duty to build an alternative. No war, but class war. The International Committee also started a campaign with very similar positions to those put forward in this resolution, which are mostly longstanding DSA positions. The exception, of course, is the specific case of this conflict. DSA's elected officials have voted repeatedly for US military aid to Ukraine. To some of us, this is a clear violation of socialist principles, and to others, it's help to a friend in need. Throughout this discussion, I want to encourage everyone to keep one question in mind. Who stands to benefit? Since the start of World War I, this has been the fundamental basis of socialists' core anti-war position. I believe the main contentious point here in the resolution and in the IC statements and position are US arms shipments to Ukraine and perhaps US withdrawal from NATO, which is to say, of course, an end to NATO because NATO is a product of US imperialism. I want to reiterate, first and foremost, the brinksmanship must end. The continued involvement of the US and NATO powers in the war brings us ever closer to war between nuclear powers. Admittedly, it may be easier to overstate how much closer. As we saw in the incident where a Ukrainian anti-air missile went off track and accidentally killed Polish citizens, cooler heads prevail, at least for now. But while it doesn't excuse the invasion of Ukraine, we also can't ignore the fact that NATO's expansionism of the last 30 years has been almost deliberately designed to provoke a military response like this one, a consequence American foreign policy analysts have been warning about since at least the late 90s. The simple fact is, if we look at who benefits, this conflict isn't bad for NATO, at least if we properly equate NATO and US empire. On a geopolitical scale, Russia is the only real challenger to US imperial hegemony in Europe, though its close economic relationship with China makes it a juicy target to weaken the US's main competitor by proxy. Keeping the war going means draining Russia's resources while dragging Ukraine deeper into the US empire. Sanctions also benefit US oil, and maybe nobody looks too hard when someone blows up a natural gas pipeline to take out the competition. Seymour Hersh reported today that there's good evidence that the US did it. And so, allegedly, NATO powers settled peace talks in the first few months of the war. The continued provision of weapons from the US serves two purposes, and one is to prolong the war. Ukraine, or at least Zelensky, refuses negotiations under the tutelage of NATO. The war is no longer one of defense, and it hasn't been for months, but it's turning a stalemate into reconquest. The US promises a constant flow of weapons for Ukraine to reconquer all of its land. Unclear whether that includes Crimea, which has been, it seems, at peace since 2014, and Ukraine sent its workers to the slaughter and demands further escalation. The second is what war always does: profit. The cost of weapons being sent to Ukraine is immense, and at least some, such as the Abrams tanks recently promised, have to be built new. It's a wrapped gift to defense contractors. This, of course, is also a dual purpose. Those weapons aren't actually free. It's not a gift to Ukraine. It is just another part of subjecting Ukraine to empire. This is without even considering where the weapons are going to. The government of Ukraine is not a friend to the workers. This is not to say that the government of Russia is, but the government of Ukraine is no more a friend to workers than the government of the United States is, and has used the war either out of its own accord or under the guidance of empire and terms of loans to crack down on socialists, on labor organizing, and third thing, I'm sorry. Anyhow, additionally, the US refuses to commit to withholding depleted uranium ammunition, which is one of the preferred types for the M2 Bradley platform, which was recently committed, which is known to cause massive increases in cancer rates through heavy metal poisoning in areas where it's used. There are farcical demands coming out for further sanctions and promises to reconquer regions that have enjoyed peace for nearly a decade. This is not something that further shipments of weapons, further war doesn't benefit workers. We need a solution through diplomacy and an effort to find peace, not more war, not reconquest. Thank you.
I would just take over from Amy. Thanks a lot, everyone engaging here in this discussion and attempting to clarify what we agree and disagree on in relation to the war in the Ukraine. So my name is Stephan Kimmerle. I'm a member of Seattle DSA, and I'm a member of the Reform and Revolution Caucus. I believe there are important disagreements, but this is a discussion amongst comrades fighting together for a democratic socialist society without war, exploitation, and oppression. As our resolution outlined, I believe that Seattle DSA should call on the DSA Congress members to publicly speak out against the Russian invasion of Ukraine, against the agenda of US imperialism in this conflict, which is contributing to a dangerous escalation, including the catastrophic threat of a nuclear war, for solidarity with the Ukrainian people and the Russian anti-war movement, for canceling Ukraine's foreign debt, for US withdrawal from NATO, closing US foreign military bases and bringing home all US troops abroad, including the 100,000 US troops deployed in Europe, and for slashing the Pentagon budget. In my view, in this debate about this approach, there appear two main disagreements. One, we are witnessing a just war by the Ukrainian people for self-determination and against the Russian imperialist invasion. And B, the intervention of US imperialism in pursuit of their own agenda against Russia and China, which runs the risk of a full-scale confrontation between nuclear powers and more wars and conflicts around the globe, from Kurdistan to Taiwan. I think we disagree on how much emphasis we give to these two dynamics, and whether we acknowledge both sides of these dynamics. Some only focus on one. I want to focus on both, and I think we can't separate them. The second disagreement I believe we have is I think we disagree about how socialists in the US can help the Ukrainian people the most and what impact NATO weapons for Zelensky have militarily and politically. I agree with my comrades tonight arguing for a different position, that we have to support the Ukrainian people, including an armed struggle against the Russian invasion. Putin launched a criminal, imperialist, and atrocious invasion against the Ukrainian people on February 24th last year. However, our support for the just fight for self-determination does not oblige us to also support the imperialist NATO intervention led by the US. Nor are we obliged to support the Zelensky regime and its policies. The NATO intervention has a long history. In successive rounds of enlargement in 1999, 2004, 2009, 2017, 2020, Eastern European and Balkan countries joined NATO. The border of NATO has moved 500 miles to the east after the fall of the Soviet Union. NATO battle groups are permanently stationed in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and so-called Defender Europe NATO operation. This is held annually, which involves 30,000 troops on the Russian border in 2021. US hegemony in NATO has been renewed and strengthened by this war. Sweden and Finland are about to join NATO, all in the name of the democratic right of self-determination of the Ukraine, while NATO member Turkey is carrying out airstrikes in Syria and Iraq against the Kurdish forces fighting for their democratic rights. A strengthened NATO is not a force for democratic rights. I'm against strengthening NATO and US imperialism. I'm against strengthening its influence and the influence of its allies, the Zelensky government in the Ukraine. I don't want either Russian or Western imperialism to be strengthened by this war. And despite the constant propaganda we are subjected to by the US media about how Russia is the biggest threat to people globally, the reality is that NATO represents 56% of global military expenditure, while Russia only accounts for 3%. How does such an approach that opposes US imperialism help the Ukrainian people in their just war? Let me outline what could end the occupation and the war against Ukraine without an escalation toward a nuclear war and without exacerbating the threat of more imperialist wars. Will this war in the Ukraine be decided purely by military strength? Will one side crush another? I don't think so. Both sides are in a brutal stalemate. It's a drawn-out war of attrition that is costing the lives of tens of thousands of Ukrainian people, while Russian soldiers are used like chess pawns that die on the battlefield. At the moment, both sides are preparing new offensives, new military offensives. It's not ruled out that one side or the other will have a military breakthrough, but it's not very likely. And each military breakthrough, without political changes of the regimes that control these armies, runs the risk of further military escalation on the global stage. Maybe in late spring, maybe in summer, when these offensives are over, there could be an acknowledgement of the stalemate and some kind of negotiations and truce. But that would lead to a divided country. It would lead to new wars and conflicts. Therefore, in my view, it's key that to reduce the military conflict, we need a political strategy to undermine the Russian military. What is needed is a growing dissatisfaction, resistance, and opposition among soldiers and working class people within Russia. Putin and his regime need to be either toppled or at least seriously challenged and paralyzed. And that's the point. All the NATO support for Ukraine and the escalation that NATO brought about helped Putin and his regime to maintain some level of public support within Russia. The Ukrainian government's policy of repressing the Russian minority within Ukraine, a war since 2014, this helps Putin. The fascist influence in the Ukraine military, the Azov regiment, and all the weapons these fascists have amassed, this helps Putin. Some overstate the impact of these fascists, some downplay it. I would just insist it's a factor. Ukrainian people pay a price, in my view, for NATO's military support for Zelensky, which is stabilizing and strengthening the Ukrainian regime. Zelensky is praised and celebrated in the West, but his regime has waged an ongoing war since 2014 against Russian people in the east of Ukraine, costing 14,000 lives before Putin invaded Ukraine. with no right of self-determination whatsoever for them. Zelensky's regime suppresses the Russian language, it bans pro-Russian parties, attacks democracy and the media in a very corrupt capitalist state. These policies of the Zelensky government, supported by US imperialism, are wrong, brutal, undemocratic, and they play in the hands of Putin. They help to stabilize the Putin regime and the support within Russia for this war. They are counterproductive to Ukraine winning its war for self-determination. I agree that there needs to be military resistance for Ukrainian self-determination. However, wars are not just resolved by military weapons alone. Otherwise, US imperialism would have won in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam, but the US lost. The outcomes of wars are also largely determined by the level of morale, public support, and power dynamics of all sides. It's not just what weapons you have, but the politics and social forces each side can mobilize. We need a socialist movement to cut across the remaining support for Putin and to cut across the attempts of Western imperialism to benefit from this situation. I believe that this is the challenge for us we face, where our resistance against the NATO intervention in the Ukraine will benefit the people in the resistance in Russia and help to build a movement there. This war is used to massively escalate military spending and global arms race. This is paid for by cuts in social welfare for the masses, and even more by the countries receiving the imperialist aggression in a much more direct ways, as Afghanistan and Iraq in the past, or Yemen, Somalia, Palestine, or the Kurdish people today. In the US, the last Biden budget increased military spending above inflation, while everything else was cut in terms of real dollar spending, adjusted to cost of living. 3 out of 4 DSA members in Congress voted for this budget. We need to criticize for them loud and clear. That's why I believe with our internationalist, working class based outline in a resolution that we put forward, we offer a way forward for an international movement that opposes NATO and Western imperialism, that opposes Russian imperialism, that stands for a resistance that is based on working class unity and solidarity. I think that DSA members in Congress need to clearly stand out against all the attacks that the Biden administration is raining down on progressives who even dare to speak about a need for negotiations. Pramila Jayapal was sending this letter praising Biden's policy, but just asking for negotiations. She was crushed and she crumbled and she gave in. I believe this is the time for socialists to stand out against the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, against the agenda of US imperialism in this conflict, which is contributing to a dangerous escalation, including the catastrophic threat of a nuclear war, for solidarity with the Ukrainian people and the Russian anti-war movement, for US withdrawal from NATO and the closing of all US foreign military bases, including those troops in Europe. A slashing of the Pentagon budget is a basis to defend also the living conditions and improve the living conditions here in the US. Thanks a lot.
All right, everybody. Tom and Dennis, is the against the resolution panel ready?
Yes.
All right, you have 25 minutes, everybody.
Thank you very much once again to argue against the resolution. My name is Dennis Bondar. I am a member of Socially Rukh, a social movement, a democratic socialist organization in Ukraine. And Ukrainian people need military aid, and military aid is a question of survival, not of war escalation. And for those of you who are listening to my presentation, I would like to recommend you to take a look at the screen, because I will be showing you slides with some facts that unfortunately have been misrepresented. So first of all, as of November 20, the total aid of US to Ukraine amounts to $144 per American, only half of which is military. What does this $144 buys? It actually buys a lot. It actually, I'm going to argue that it prevented the largest genocide in Europe since Holocaust. How do I know this? In April 2020, Russian-owned state media published an article called "What Russia Should Do with Ukraine." And it explicitly, in explicit terms, called for complete destruction of Ukrainian states, as well as the complete destruction of Ukrainian identity. Here you go. Plain language, no BS, Putin's BS about Bolsheviks artificially created Ukraine. On May 8th, just before the Victory Day in Russia, the deputy of the Russian State Duma in primetime TV explicitly said he called for exterminating 2 million Ukrainians. Here you go, screenshots are on the screen. Again, from the horse's mouth, very explicitly stated what they want to do. A lot is being talked about far-right forces in Ukraine. But what about far-right in the Russian side, which have been engaged since 2014? For example, Socially Rukh on the left and Russian imperial movement. Socially Rukh is not only a member of a Wagner paramilitary, but also a part of so-called Luhansk People's Republic militia. Just a little bit of leftist rhetoric here. Now, moreover, USA to Ukraine is not only morally correct, but it's legally justifiable. And it's very unfortunate that no mainstream media covered this aspect. In particular, I'm referring to the Budapest Memorandum. When Ukraine became an independent state, it was the third largest nuclear state in the world. In 1994, it signed the Budapest Memorandum with the United States, UK, and Russia. It gave up all its nuclear weapons completely, everyone, in exchange for security assurances and territorial integrity. Once again, signatories are UK and Russia and US. Russia has grossly violated this international document, this officially ratified on the level of UN. Basically, the non-proliferation treaty of nuclear weapon is jeopardized. For example, people in 70% of people in South Korea believe that they should start building nuclear weapons because of such a gross violations. Furthermore, Ukraine is a signatory to the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Ukraine, signed at the end of the Cold War between NATO and former Warsaw Pact. According to this treaty, Ukraine destroyed 2,000 tanks, 1,500 personal carrier armed vehicles, and 50 airplanes. So since 2007, Russia temporarily suspended participating in this treaty. And I would like to remind you that in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. Now, so if Ukraine asks for a couple of tanks, for a couple of hundreds of tanks, for a couple of tens of tanks, for a little bit of planes, this is very little, peanuts compared to what has been given up according to the very serious legally binding obligations, not some empty oral promises. Now, I would like to go to historical background about this war. So this war, this is a short history of the war. The war between Russia and Ukraine started just before Euromaidan. Please do not call it coup d'etat. If you hear this word coup d'etat, just don't listen who uses this. This is just absolutely incorrect. It's ignorant of what's actually was happening. So Euromaidan is, of course, also not the best name, but nevertheless, it's not coup d'etat either. So the Euromaidan was a popular uprising. Here's the map showing you a number of participants participating in Euromaidan movement. As you can see, it's distributed all across the country, with most of the participants being in the center of the country, as you can see. Now, while the Yanukovych ran with his few minions, the parliament was of course intact. The rest of the government was intact. Russia started to annex Crimea. From February 20 to March 18 of 2014. How do we know these dates? These are dates literally printed on the mandate that Putin gave to participants in this annexation. Now, until the April 7, there were peaceful protests in Donbass, both pro-Ukrainian and anti-Maidan so-called anti-Maidan protests. However, in April, but there is no sociological evidence from that time that people of Donbass wanted to actually do any uprising or separatist movement. There's no evidence of that at all. But so they had to be forced, literally forced. On April 7, pro-Russian protesters seized the local government building in Donetsk and declared so-called People Republic. Right. On April 8, Lugansk People Republic is declared in the same fashion by capturing the government building. Now, on April 12th, Igor Girkin, a retired FSB officer, took control of an administrative building in Slovyansk. Igor Girkin is absolutely, if you don't know him, you should Google, you should know him. Basically, he is a key figure in this war. And he's so openly about his participation. He's openly admitted to serious war crimes, like using human shields. He even gave interviews to Ukrainian journalists, saying that if it were not for his armed men and his armed gang to come to Donetsk, there would be no uprising. He literally said this in 2019 with interview to Ukrainian journalists. By the way, Igor Girkin is also acquitted by the tribunal, is one of the responsible for shooting down the Malaysian airline Boeing. So on airport 14, Russian officers are spotted in eastern Ukraine, giving instructions to defected police officers. And only on April 15, as you can see, only on April 20, interim Ukraine government declares beginning of the anti-terrorist operation. So please, there is no shelling the people of Donbass before. It's just you get your timeline correct. There is no absolutely. Yes, it was people were protesting. It was a political discussion which would have been absolutely resolved in a peaceful fashion if it were not for the direct intervention by military people paramilitary and military from Russia. Now, there was a lot of talk about, banned parties in Ukraine. Frankly speaking, these kind of parties deserve to be banned. Let me just begin by showing a political advertisement run on Ukrainian TV by one of those banned parties, which are called the Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine. Take a look at this video. An old woman is, trying to pray, and then she comes, and here you go. The priest rotates, and you can see the priest is black. And she's scared. And the message reads, let's save the canonical Orthodox Christianity. This is the most open racist advertisement imaginable. I am, as a Ukrainian, I'm proud that they're banned. This kind of racist filth has no place on TV in the name of political plurality, screw them, And by the way, she fun fact that just before the big invasion fell on February 20, she appealed to international community to exercise the international convention on elimination of all form of racial discrimination to denazify Ukraine. Now she's gonna teach us who is racist by putting this kind of racial advertisement. Also, by the way, her son plays a very prominent role in post-Biden energy sector. She actually benefited personally a lot in the new political environment post-Biden. So, and furthermore, we can go down the list of these parties. These are marginal parties with the direct links to Russia, financial links to Russia, advocated racist, xenophobic, and anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, very, very vile stuff, as I showed you an example. So there is no independent trade union is banned, plenty of those are available. Now, finally, I would like to present to you sociological surveys from Ukraine, where Ukrainian people, which are available about the war, how war should be resolved. This is a very important discussion. Everybody talks about what Russian thinks, but let's see here what Ukrainians thinks. The first poll I would like to show you, it's a question that's being asked: in which direction is country going? Is it going right direction, wrong direction? The poll starts here from 2011, and polling ends in the summer of 2022, last summer. And as you can see, the wrong direction has been dominated. Most people were saying that for a long time that country is going wrong direction. Only during Euromaidan, there is an uptick. People are seeing has more positive outlook, but then it crashes immediately as the war in Donbass breaks out and annexation of Crimea takes place. Now, take a look. When Zelensky comes to government, assumes an office. By the way, Stefan, Zelensky was not in power since 2014. Just to again, small factual evidence. Zelensky comes to office in 2019, and you can see on a peace platform, and this uptick in the public, for the first time in the public opinion, says that the country is going in the right direction. We see 55%, but then it collapses back. And when the full-scale invasion starts, majority of people, over 3% people, high 70% say the country is going right there, despite this tragic loss, horrors, destruction. People have high confidence in the current government. This is just facts. Now, who is the best promoter of NATO in Ukraine? Of course, Vladimir Putin. He's definitely deserves an award from NATO. Whereas joining European Union was always popular among Ukrainians, NATO was much more thorny issue. Before Euromaidan, this is a polling, I have a polling which only starts in 2014, but before Euromaidan, most of the people were opposing joining NATO. You can see that, most of the people were opposing. After Euromaidan and after annexation of Crimea and after the beginning of the war in Donbass, of course, most people started to support joining NATO. But when they went full, and again, it's not yet still even a majority, like a kind of a clear cut, because remember, if to join NATO, you would need to have a referendum. But anyway, nobody wanted Ukrainian NATO. No NATO member country wanted it. So this is all mythology. This is just a polling data. And when full-scale invasion happens, again, how many people oppose invasion? Oppose NATO in Ukraine? 3%, basically statistical error. 86% is for joining NATO. Again, who did this? Vladimir Putin did this. Now, question, how to achieve peace in Russia? So this is the polling that is taken in May 2020, July, September, and December. And I would like to remind you that in October, this September, October, this is where these large terrorist attacks on civil infrastructure start to take place. So December is the very relevant polling. Especially. So look at this, most of the people, 85% people consistently, overwhelming majority of the people, overwhelming percent, say, I would like to quote, under no circumstances should Ukraine give up any of its territories, even if because of this, the war will last longer and there will be threats to the preservation of independence. Once again, 85% of Ukrainian population say this. And you may say, what about, ethnic divides, right? Or linguistic divide. Here it is breakdown of the same answer by linguistic divide. So Ukrainian speaking Ukrainians, 89%, war must go on. We cannot surrender any territory. Bilingual, 86. Russian speaking, 76, and vast majority of people in all linguistic categories do not support any concession to Russia because there is zero trust by this now, having violated all important international treaties. Russian Putin regime has violated all, there is no support. And finally, I would like to emphasize that these discussions that we are having right now, this is not an internal DSA discussion. People of large Ukrainian society is actually closely following in discussions that are happening in the West. Believe me or not, even for relatively small small organizations, relatively small organization, and this is an extremely painful parallel. The rhetoric used by Western leftists is extremely painful. It reminds the echo of what happened during horrors of Stalinism, in particularly during Holodomor, a famine, Stalin-made man-made famine that took, for estimates range from 2 to 7 million lives. Vast majority of them are Ukrainians, and these listed here, that are these left deniers of campus. Literally, they're saying, oh, Ukrainian peasants are starving themselves, so that Stalin, so that imperialists, will be telling you that this is like Stalin is not succeeding. Guys, this is nonsense. It's important to remember these lessons of historical campism that led to actually. Especially immigrant community of Ukrainians turning rightwards, even though it was actually pretty left-wing. So please be careful with resolutions like this. These resolutions do not, as I hope, convince you with facts and evidence. They do not represent the reality. They do not represent Ukrainian people. Ukrainian people are extremely against this. And finally, I would like to mention that this is a national anti-colonial war of national survivors, and opposition to military is a betrayal of solidarity and self-determination. And campism has historical and material consequences. And thanks to the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Network and larger Ukraine Solidarity Network. Thank you very much.
Tom, you good to go?
All right. So my name's Tom. I am a member of Seattle DSA. Actually, most of my work is a member of the Housing Justice Work Group, and most of my work's around that. And I'll try and make this March. And thanks for allowing me to address this issue. I'm going to talk about how the Ukraine is being portrayed, and then the issue of solidarity. I'm going to be covering brief points on all this stuff. The Zelensky government on democracy, the Zelensky government on corruption, the nature of the Russian regime on corruption and democracy, by contrast, the issue of two sides to the conflict, the real meaning of the concept of solidarity, and the question of how does the war end. So, first of all, Dennis covered most of this, but I just want to point out that there has been numerous people that have commented on the issue of which parties have been banned. This slide talks about a guy who is from the All-Ukrainian Independent Trade Union, Zakis Pracy, and he basically goes into some of the groups that have been banned, which are in fact not, they may say they're socialists, but they are not actually socialist. The one person that Dennis recommended or referenced was this woman who is regarded, the Progressive Socialist Party is generally a black, regarded as a racist Black Hundreds party. So there are plenty of Ukrainian socialist parties which are both active and legal, and also are working, on issues like the support for the Ukrainian working class. So it's not what you've been hearing. On the issue of corruption, the fact is that all the countries that were part of the former Soviet Union have faced this issue. This is basically a question of the lack of exposure to normal Western government norms and the transformation of former communists into oligarchs. Ukraine is actually in the midst of dealing with these problems, as can be seen by recent events in late January, where the deputy defense minister was dismissed after he was accused of corruption using ministry funds to purchase food and tactical winter clothing at above market rates. And there has also been a wholesale replacement of several deputy administrators and several regional administrators. So yeah, does Ukraine have a corruption problem? No doubt. Are they dealing with it? Yes, they are. And I'll point out that they've also been part of a EU anti-corruption formation since 2017. So this is not just this week. Meanwhile, in Russia, they seem to be going in the opposite direction. Putin has actually terminated Russia's membership in the group of seven, the group of states against corruption. This last week, in fact, there's new legislation that just rolled out that exempts Russian lawmakers from a previous requirement that they disclose details of their income, their expenses, and their property. And of course, we all, I'm sure we're all really familiar with the recent anti-LGBTQ legislation that actually strengthened the 2013 anti-gay, propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations, as they call it there. So you can imagine what will happen to the Ukraine if Russia gains control over the government there. So next is just this question of the two sides. Yeah, there are two sides to this issue. There is an anti-imperialist conflict between the US and Russia, and there also is a genuine anti-fascist opposition to the Russian invasion. This is not really a point of disagreement. All sides to this debate acknowledge that the US and NATO support is not pure support for Ukraine democracy, that NATO has done various things that should be opposed, that, and of course, Russia's done various things that should be opposed. Hello, can we do both sides of this? So there's no reason why socialists can openly oppose imperialist aims from either side of the conflict or be honest about that. But the acknowledgement of that should not keep us from supporting in real material ways the just struggle of the Ukrainian people against fascist invasion. So I want to talk just a little bit about the resolution itself. The resolution says the social forces we look to that can achieve a just revolution are the resistance of the Ukrainian people against the Russian invasion and the building of a mass Russian anti-war movement supported by peace movements in the US and around the world. Okay, great, awesome. Couldn't agree more. Yet it says that DSA should demand that they, meaning our DSA representatives, should vote against US weapons and military aid to the pro-NATO, pro-capitalist, blah, 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 corrupt Ukrainian government. So this is a contradiction, comrades. And I don't know how you could put these two statements alongside each other and talk about them. The resolution calls for a conference that should build solidarity with the Russian anti-war movement and highlight anti-NATO voices in Europe. So newsflash, the Russian anti-war movement is at great risk, opposing Putin's invasion, not NATO, through everything from small-scale protests, which are pretty much all they can get away with, to the actual sabotage of Russia's war infrastructure. And that is what we should support. The hypocrisy of solidarity with Ukraine, which not only the resolution, but several other people have called for, while calling for an arms embargo. Not a single group or individual in support of denying weapons to Ukraine has been able to answer two very simple questions. Where else are Ukrainians supposed to get weapons from to defend themselves? And as a corollary to that, how are they supposed to prevail against the destruction of their state and their national identity without advanced weapons? Solidarity is not a meaningless concept or the revolutionary equivalent of good luck. Either they have the right to defend themselves by all means necessary, or they don't. Socialists need to take a stand on this. Lastly, there's this call that criticizes Congressman Jayapal for pulling back her letter, which states that the letter apparently says that Biden should pursue diplomatic talks with Russia. This is a call to rely on two imperialist powers to end the war, both of which we supposedly oppose. So why are we calling for these two powers to end the war when we are not, in fact, in support of either of these imperialist powers? Comrades, I close with this. How does the war end? The war ends when Russia realizes it cannot win and begins to honestly negotiate its withdrawal from the territory of Ukraine. Thank you.
All right, thank you to all our speakers. And personally, as a Seattle DSA member, thank you for, I believe, the first time in our organization's history having a meeting go, a set of panels go under instead of overtime. Now, at this point, we actually have a few extra minutes to our added on to our next section, which is a question discussions from the audience. Connor will be acting as our stack.